Though not physically with us today, I'm very pleased to present our first keynote speaker, Professor Dibyesh Anand from Westminster University, London. Professor Anand is the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Global Engagement and Employability at the University of Westminster, a Professor of International Relations. He is the author of the monographs Geopolitical Exotica, Tibet in Western Imagination, and Tibet, a Victim of Geopolitics, and Hindu Nationalism in India and the Politics of Fear. He has researched, spoken about, and published extensively on varied topics, including post-colonial politics and international relations, Tibet, China-India border dispute, Hindu nationalism, Islamophobia, and colonial practices of post-colonial states. He is the co-chair of Westminster Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, EDI Committee, the chair of London's Higher EDI Network, and a member of Research England's Expert Advisory Group. His lecture is entitled Politics of Fear in Majoritarian Regimes. Professor Anand, the floor is yours.
I wish I was there, then it would be even fuller. But again, thank you, Ronie. Thank you, Tel Aviv University. Thank you, Dan David Foundation, for organizing this important conference.
And thank you so much for joining us. Yeah.
And I understand that, of course, it's a very difficult time, but
indeed,
where the organizers were writing to us to say, would you be coming in person or not? And we said, let's wait, because of course, we were very keen. I was very keen on coming in person. And only I made a decision early November that it's not possible. And the reason for it not being possible is not the safety issue. I understand that's a concern.
True.
The two things. There are no direct flights between London and Tel Aviv these days, other than the Israeli airlines. And second, you have to go through a lot of risk assessment within university before you go somewhere.
There was no way in which,
yeah, we would have done that. But I do think that it's actually important to have this now, rather than wait for an ideal time. Because when we are dealing with what other speakers talked about, de-democratization, there's never an ideal time where we can actually sit and have the luxury of talking without any other crisis. So we're dealing with a constant crisis one after another. I know this is an exceptional crisis, but that's very much part and parcel of it. I'm grateful and very honored that you have me here. I'm no expert on Israel. You understand, because see, but I do want to connect various things.
Please do.
My expertise on, let's say, bigotry, right-wing nationalism in Hindu nationalism in India. So it's a right-wing form of nationalism. But I also want to connect with a left-wing form of nationalism, which is in China.
Please
so
do.
Han chauvinism.
Professor Anand, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So I just wanted to say that I wanted to connect to various kinds of nationalism, use examples from China, from India, from Turkey, and from other parts of the world. And you see there are very different forms of majoritarian regimes here. So, therefore, the phenomenon I want to talk about, politics of fear, is not confined only to right-wing forms of nationalism. It can also exist in left-wing kind of nationalisms, for instance, in case of China. So when we say majoritarian nationalism, and majoritarian regimes, first we have to remember we are talking of an ideology rather than empirical fact. So India is not a Hindu nation. It's being created into a Hindu nation. And that's something to bear in mind, because while majority people in India might be Hindu, what it means to be Hindu could be quite divisive and divided. So first and foremost, we have to understand that the majoritarian regimes that claim to speak in the name of the majority, the first and foremost target is to create a majority, which may not exist. That majority can be around religious lines. It can be around ethnic lines. It can be around other forms of lines, but it would be a creation project. So first to bear in mind, majoritarian regimes are not based on empirical historical facts, but they're essentially an ideological, political project to create an entity of certain kinds. That's number one. Now, you may think of China, and China fine is a Han majority. 92% population would be Han in China. The reality is, of course, what it means to be Han has always been contested. And Communist Party of China. So when Communist Party came to power with People's Republic of China in 1949, first thing they did was, of course, create the whole category of Han. How do you create a category of Han? You create a category of Han by creating other categories of minorities. So you have to have minority in order to have majority. And their own nationality policy, remember, they were inspired by Soviet Union to an extent. Nationality policy was about Han being the majority and 55 other nationalities. They meant national minorities. So very much Han was a creation project. It was a political project. Now, in 1950s and 60s, in case of China, there was a recognition that there are two kinds of nationalisms that are inimical to Communist Party. One, of course, is minority nationalisms. So Tibetan, the Uyghur, the Hui, the Mongolian, these are enemies possibly. But what's also inimical is Han chauvinism. So there was recognition in Communist Party that Han chauvinism, which would essentially mean Han supremacism, can also be an enemy. So in one sense, 1950s and 60s and 70s, in case of People's Republic of China, there was a recognition that the threat to communism comes not only from minority nationalisms, but also majority nationalism. And they have to balance somehow. Yet, it sounds like I wouldn't say liberal nationalism, but it sounds like a progressive form of nationalism, which is recognizing majoritarian nationalism also the problem. But from the very beginning, communist version of nationalism recognized that while Han chauvinism is bad and can be a threat, ultimately, China is a Han state, in the sense that Han are the progressive majority who will teach and tell how minorities should live. So from the very beginning of 1950s, even under Mao's period, you had paternalism towards minorities. But that was very much part and parcel of it. Take example of India, very different examples, a liberal democracy from 1950s onwards. It was a secular, liberal form of nationalism that was dominant. It was not Hindu nationalism. So it was very clear that you're Hindu, Muslim, Christian, you're all Indian if you're Indian. Yet from the very beginning, if you look at the actual conduct of the state, there was a recognition that Hindus can be progressive. Muslims need to be taught how to be progressive. You see, there was a paternalism from the very beginning. Yet, again, I mean, from what my limited understanding of Israel also, if you take example from late 1940s and 50s onwards, the dominant forms of Zionism were often liberal forms of Zionism, even to in liberal left form of Zionism, that still had an idea that Jews can come together, but it was to not extend the form of right-wing Zionism that exists today, right, which is very exclusionary. So what I'm just saying is, at various points in time, countries I'm interested in had forms of nationalism that, at least on paper, were inclusive, could include others, especially in case of China, India, and Turkey to an extent. But what, of course, we found was there have been forms of nationalism, so majoritarian nationalism, now we are talking of regime now, but the forms of nationalism have been there from very beginning. Forms of nationalism that were very clear that we cannot have an inclusive, pluralist nationalism, because inclusive, pluralist nationalism is ultimately inimical to the majority. Remember, I said to you, when they say inimical to majority, they don't mean majority that exists, but majority in their head, what ought to be the majority. And in these majoritarian nationalist movements, as well as regimes, there is an obsessive focus on history in different ways. Of course, when I say China, India, Israel, or Turkey, they're quite different, right? Even Pakistan, by the way, they're quite different, but they have some similarity. So the idea of history is there was some kind of glory period at one point in time, in most cases, but there's also a whole notion of trauma. They're all driven by the notion of trauma, that we have had traumatic history in the past. And the reason we had traumatic history was because our people were not united. And the other people took advantage of that disunity and either ruled us or expelled us or turned us into a diaspora or conquered us. So in case of China, there's a whole century of humiliation. So 150 years of humiliation that China experienced from 1840s onwards till 1940s, till basically Communist Party brought back the old glory. But why was, in this case, China humiliated? It was due to external enemies, the West, Japan. But essentially, it was humiliated because of the internal enemies. Who are the internal enemies? It is the minorities, but also those members of majority who did not recognize that you have to have unity. That every point in time, the enemies are external but also internal. And internal enemies are not only the religious and ethnic minorities, but also those from the majority who do not recognize they ought to be united. Take example of Hindu nationalism in India. The enemies are, of course, the Muslims and the British. By the way, the British, they say British, but they turn into Christian for some reason. But Muslims and the Christians, the religious minority in India today, but the enemies are also the secular liberal Hindus who, for some reason, according to them, are what they would call the self-hate, the self-hating Hindus who do not recognize they need to be united. So from very beginning. In case of Erdogan's form of Islamist nationalism, the enemies are, of course, Westerners, but enemies are also other Arabs, by the way, and all of those who had this whole affair of Ottoman. To an extent, even Ottomans are enemies, because Ottomans are more pluralist than what they would wanted. In this case, they also see enemies as the secular Turkish nationalists, who were quite, by the way, to an extent, almost fascist. The way their notion of secular nationalism was quite based on expulsion. We know of expulsion of Armenians and extermination of Armenians, expulsion of Greeks, expulsion of anyone who did not fit into the image. And yet, even those secular Turkish nationalists are seen as inimical by Erdogan's form of Islamist nationalism, where everyone is an enemy external, but essentially the enemies are internal. So something in common between all majoritarian regimes, when they become regimes, or majoritarian nationalism when they are not in power, is that the ultimate enemies are internal, not external. So if you take example of how Netanyahu behaves, he conducts himself, you'd find, yes, he could talk of, when I say external, other countries as enemies, right? So any criticism of Israeli government is branded as anti-Semitism, right? So all the world is anti-Semitic, UN is anti-Semitic, everyone is almost anti-Semitic, but the key enemy for him are ultimately, and as the first speaker talked about, the law in Israel, the judiciary in Israel, the academics in Israel, the activists in Israel, and ultimately the Israeli democracy is the enemy for him. Right? So you could see that ultimate enemy and inimical forces are internal there also. We find something similar everywhere. So in history, they have an imagination of glorious history, but ultimately trauma. The present is when they see themselves as vanguards of fight. So they have, what's common to majority nationalists as well as regimes when they come to power is, of course, that they see themselves as constant battle. They have to wage a war against external enemies, but also internal enemies. And the future that's promised is the focus that you have to sacrifice today, including sacrifice democracy if you need to, sacrifice progressive ideas, inclusion, etc., because ultimately the promises of a glorious future where the majority ultimately awakened enough to recognize what's good for them, are united, and ultimately, even though the majority amongst majority may not like the majoritarian regimes or majoritarian nationalists, they will ultimately win. That's a promise of glorious future. In that glorious future, of course, you have got what happens to the minorities. They're either domesticated, or they're expelled, or they're exterminated. That's how it is, right, for minorities. What happens to those who are of your kind but may not agree with you, liberal, progressive, it could be left in some context, right in other contexts. By the way, in case of China, it could be the right. What happens to them is, again, out of fear and respect, ultimately, they acknowledge the supremacy, or they also leave the country, or they get domesticated. They may not be exterminated per se, because extermination is generally kept for not the political opponents, but for the ethnic/religious opponents, according to these nationalist movements. But how have they functioned? So again, my own work has primarily been on India and also on China. These two are the conduct. And along with the second keynote speaker who you have tomorrow, Professor Nitasha Kaul, there's a book that's coming out very soon from us. It focuses on India and Turkey and Kurds and Kashmir. So again, some of it will overlap there. So one, we look at it. So the enemies are ultimately, the worst enemies are the religious minorities or ethnic minorities, depending on the context. And those minorities, why are they enemies? So in case of India, the Muslims are the primary enemies. They're 13% of population. They have ruled us in the past. That's how it's presented. So they're enemies because, of course, they're socially backward. but also dangerous. So they're enemies because they're different, but they're also enemies because they have a conspiracy ultimately to overwhelm us. So in case of Muslims, the narrative goes like this. So Muslims are outsiders. Their loyalty is ultimately not to India, but to somewhere else, right? Somewhere else could be anywhere in the Muslim world, somewhere else. So they are ultimately cannot be trusted. They are working with the outside forces in order to weaken India. How are they working towards it? Again, in my own work and my own book, I have coined the term, porno nationalism for it. They have a very violent pornographic imagination of Muslim other. A rapacious, seductive Muslim other, mostly male, who's out there to seduce our women, destroy our families, take over our communities, and ultimately spoil Mother India. That's how it's imagined. So at every stage, Muslim is an enemy. So they're enemy because they're the terrorists, they're the extremists, but ultimately, I said, they also are out there to overpopulate us and take over, ultimately. Now, the reality is, if you look at the population statistics in India and everything, even if the same fertility rate continues forever and without any change, and there's somehow no change in education for religious minorities, etc., possibility is 300 to 400 years by when Muslims might even be 1/3 of the population. Forget more than that. But even though that's recognized, but the constant view that they're going to overtake us 100 years later or 50 years later or 10 years later. So there's a specter of overpopulating Muslims. That's the key part, right? So that's there. So Muslims are enemies mainly because they're extremist terrorists, backward, etc., but ultimately because it pose a threat to our family, our way of life, our nation through overpopulation. What about Christians? Christians are barely 2% of population in India. Now, of course, there's no data that shows Christians as overpopulating in any sense. So their focus is that through conversion, that yes, Christians are only minority, but because somehow they're backed by the West, the imagination of the entire West against India, even though empirically there's no evidence of that, right? The notion is Christians will not overpopulate, but through conversion. So the idea somehow that Hindus are being converted and they will do that. So these are two enemies. In case of China, we Muslims are ethnic Chinese Muslims. They are often seen as enemies because they're prone to extremism. Now, again, there are no attacks in case of China by Hui Muslims in most contexts, right? But imagine. But the key focus remains is on Uyghur Muslims and on Tibetan Buddhists and on Inner Mongolians and on Hong Kongers. In this case, it's partly religious, but mainly ethnic. For China, the key focus is they will tolerate religion because of 1982 constitution. But please bear in mind that in case of China, the party is above the state, party is above the government, and party is above constitution. So in case of, for instance, Israel, you can take the government to the court, right? So we talk of constitutional crisis, but at least there's a constitution where you can take the government to the court. In India also, you can take the government to the court because courts are ultimately, Supreme Courts are above, they're independent. In case of China, the army is People's Liberation Army. It's not an army of Chinese state. It's a army of Communist Party of China. People's Court or People's Supreme Court is not a state court, it is party's court. So ultimately, the one that you can never take to the court is the Communist Party, right? But in their case, again, the reason I mentioned that, of course, is you have got certain imagination of Uyghur Muslim other or Tibetan Buddhist others. Their focus is that specifically they are anxious about Islam and Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, because the main leader of Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama, is in exile. So they can't control it. They don't have specific problem with Protestant Christianity. They have a problem with Catholicism. And why? Because the Pope is abroad. You see, what I'm saying is for China, it's very clear that ultimately religion has to be a patriotic religion. And that's the focus for last 20 years, that religion has to be patriotic, which means it has to be controlled by the state. But they can't control the Pope and they can't control the Dalai Lama. There's a problem. Now, in case of Islam, because there's no Pope or Dalai Lama kind of figure, they have tried to domesticate it. But in case of Uyghurs, they have not been able to. Therefore, the concentration camps, the work camps, everything. In case of Uyghurs, if you know, that's what they do. So there the imagination is Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Inner Mongolians. Inner Mongolia, by the way, there's Mongolia. In case if you know the history, it's a very basic thing for you, but there was a broad Mongolian region. And Outer Mongolia became independent because Soviet Union made it independent. And People's Republic of China had no option but to recognize independence because they depended on aid from Soviet Union in the 1950s. However, the Inner Mongolia became part of China. And the population of Mongol in Inner Mongolia is less than 1/8 now. That's so. In case of China, the main form through which they domesticate the minority and minority regions is through population transfer and demographic transformation. So in Xinjiang, East Turkestan is an illegal term in China, by the way, right? But East Turkestan, what Uyghurs call and what China calls Xinjiang. In case of Xinjiang, the population of Uyghurs is less than 50% now, demographic transformation. In case of Tibet, officially on paper, it's still 90% Tibetans, but anyone who's been to Tibet knows how it's changing rapidly there too. So demographic transformation is the main way. But for them, ultimately, minorities can never be trusted because they're a problem. In case of Turkey, you have got something similar. The secularists didn't even recognize Kurds as separate. For them, it was mountainous Turks. These are backward Turkish people who have to be domesticated, transformed, and made civilized. That's what the Ataturk's form of secular/fascist form of nationalism was. And with Erdogan, when he came to power, he did promise recognition of recognition of Kurdish language in the first 10 years. But from 2014 onwards, as progressive Kurdish parties became very powerful, or not very powerful, but it became political entities on their own, he started adopting politics which is very similar to Ataturk. So while they have a secular versus Islamist thing, on Kurds, they broadly agree. Kurds are seen as those who are forever inimical, right? Because Kurds are seen as sometimes too Islamist by the secularists in the past, too patriarchal, again by the secularists in the past, now too feminist because of the left-wing movement in Kurds, because of PKK and its political expressions from HDP and other parties, too feminist, too left-wing, too progressive. But minorities in these cases are always seen as too something, too extremist, too progressive, too liberal, not liberal enough, but they're never seen as normal. So that's a common thing we find, right? Now, so the idea, of course, is in all these cases that minorities are seen as ultimate threats who, through overpopulation, through working with outside actors, through dividing our own community, will somehow overtake us. So they are always enemies. So there's a fear of minorities. But ultimately, in all these regimes, the fear is not only of minorities, but also of the majority themselves. The liberals, the seculars, the progressives, those who believe in inclusive forms of nationalism, they become the main enemy. In case of India, so there's a minority, right? So the focus is first the Muslims, then the Christians, then the communists, because communists are also seen as outsiders in case of in India. In case of China, it's not the communists, it's basically the Democrats, right? By the way, when I say Democrats in Chinese context, I don't mean Democrat Party of US, but Democrats, pro-democracy movement. All of them are seen as enemies. But ultimate enemies are those from our own community who do not believe that minorities are the enemies. The minorities ought to be domesticated. Minorities ought to be controlled. Minorities ought to be demonized. Minorities ought to be expelled, or minorities ought to be exterminated. So the parts of the self from the majority community are seen also as the enemies. Again, I think Israel is a good example, a very good example, where for Netanyahu and his supporters, possibly many of you are number one enemies. Not even Palestinians. Yes, Hamas could be declared as enemy from time to time, but if you look at the ideology of Hamas and how they've operated, very exclusivist, very exclusionary, conduct is terrorist, and of course behavior is very extremist. Something similar is taking place from the government side in terms of the ideology, at least, right? Ultimate enemies are people like yourselves. And I have to say, I was very heartened to listen to the president of Tel Aviv University talking about it. I was imagining, and I'm not going to write in public, that I really can't imagine a president or a vice chancellor of an Indian university or Chinese university or Turkish university these days. Turkish used to have it, but Turkish leaders were quite brave at one point in time, but that's gone 10 years ago, ever making those kind of statements. And I want to just say that I understand that for you in Israel, you might feel that there's a crisis, there's a possibly de-democratization, there is, and there's a grave threat. But in one sense, you already have other places which had democracy of various forms, but are more inclusive nationalism of various forms. Things have already gotten worse. But frankly, I don't even imagine, by the way, in the UK or US these days, presidents of universities or vice chancellors of universities taking that stance. So I just want to thank you and acknowledge you for doing that, right? Coming back to it. So the liberals, the secularists, all of them are seen as enemies. And why are they enemies? Because they're seen as the enemies within. Not only within the territory, but within our own identity. So you can't create a solid majoritarian self if part of that majority do not adhere to you or do not accept your ideology. So how do you deal with them? You deal with them by declaring them to be anti-national. You deal with them by declaring them to be self-hating Jews. You declare them to be self-hating Hindus, self-hating Han, self-hating Turk, self-hating Muslim or whatever. That's how you do it. So you declare them to be self-hating, right? And deal with that. How do you deal with them? Because, of course, partly law may be in your favor, but law may not in your favor. You start capturing institutions. So capturing of institutions is fundamental to how majoritarian nationalists become regime and then become the government by domesticating and controlling the institutions. Institutions are universities. Institutions are basically the legal ones, the courts. Civil society comes later, but you do it, right? So you have control institutions. And ultimately, state capture. At the heart of the desire for creating a majoritarian self lies the ultimate fantasy to capture the state. Therefore, you'd find that all the time they talk of the deep state. And in case of Turkey, possibly there was a deep state at one point in time. That's largely gone, right? And case of Turkey until 15 years ago, where the constitution court was very strong, it was seen as pro-military, military was seen as secularism, but that's all gone now, right? Now, by the way, Turkey is also interesting because while the secularists, as I said, were secularists, their version of secularism was very much based on an identity where the norm was a Sunni Muslim. And this is why in 1910, there was Armenian genocide, and late 1910s and early 1920s, there was an extermination and expulsion of Armenians and Greeks because you had to create a pure state. And that's secularist, but they did that, right? So just bear that in mind, that sometimes secularism may not be answered because secularism can also adopt very similar kind of politics, which is very exclusionary one. So politics of fear is based on the fear of the other, religious other, ethnic other. It's based on the fear of the self, the part of the self that refuses to conform to whatever your notion of the self is. It is very much based on also of then demonizing those parts of the self that refuse to agree to your political ideology by seeing them as, and I've looked at it in Hindutva context, as effeminate, weak, not masculinist enough. Because ultimately the majoritarian politics is a politics of masculinism and masculinization. So in case of India, there's very much clear that the ideal Hindu self is the one where basically a new masculine self that's going to teach lessons through others, right? That's there. So once you have a politics of fear, fear of the other, fear of the self, what do you do? What you do, of course, is you have to awaken yourself. There's a lot of focus on awakening the self, awakening through education, awakening through control of education, awakening through control over religious education is there. So part and parcel of all of this is very much an awakening. Awakening is the heart of it. So a lot of time when majoritarian nationalists or majoritarian, those who become regime later, when they were focused very much on transforming from the kindergarten level, from the childhood level, the knowledge and control knowledge, a lot of time liberals and the secularists, our approach was to laugh at them. Come on, what stupid people are there? It's like, Trump, majority of the liberals, these are stupid. That's really not possible. That's really not possible. And I have to say that when I say we, I'm including that part of the liberal left in this context. In China context, I would not be liberal left. Well, I'll be liberal, but possibly liberal something else, centrist right there possibly is. In all those contexts, we have to understand that the project of creation of majoritarian self is based partly through awakening, creation of new knowledges that declare all the other forms of knowledge, inclusive forms of knowledge, as effeminate, as weak, as inimical, right? There's awakening part. But it's not enough to awaken the mind. You have to awaken the body. You have to awaken the body politic. So in my own work, I've looked at the ways in which, of course, they organize. So even older than India, older than Israel, older than People's Republic of China, is an organization in India called Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS. This is a paramilitary organization, and paramilitary organization was formed almost, it will be 100 years ago. That's one of the largest organizations in the world today. It is a fascist organization, by the way. They used to admire Mussolini and Hitler both. Now, of course, they admire Israel and they admire Netanyahu, right? But the point I want to mention this is to you because it's a fascist organization. They wanted to create a strong Hindu nationalist self. And they were not really religious, by the way. They wanted to create a Hindu nationalist, but they were not religious because they also saw Hindu religion as weak and effeminate. For them, therefore, and I'm sure you'd find right-wing forms of, let's say, in Israel politics would also see parts of Judaism as quite weak and not good enough to organize the identity, right? You have got the awakening part, you have got the organizing part. You also have got the domestication of the others, that's very much part and parcel of it, sidelining them, using fear to induce and control people, but ultimately violence. At the heart of majoritarian nationalism and politics also lies the idea of violence, that violence is seen as something pure. Violence is going to pure you of your impurities, pure you by showing the minorities their place, but also pure you through showing your liberals and effeminate people in your own community, that ultimately violence is the answer. So it's quite violent deliberately. So, right, there's an awakening part, there's an organization part, there's a violence part, there's, as I said, the state capture part. The state has to be captured because ultimately the fantasies of a political entity, a polity where you have peace, a peace based on a majoritarian identity. But for that, you need violence. But ultimately, you need a situation where anyone who doesn't agree with you lives in fear, even though at this point in time, you are using fear against them. Right? So the ultimate fantasy is, of course, I would say ultimate fantasy is a fascist fantasy of fascism, because the whole notion, of course, is that it's a pure one. It's one, and in case of India, with what I said, it's one leader, one party, one state. Right. So in reality, of course, it's a multi-party democracy, but the ideology being promoted, of course, is you've got one leader. You criticize the leader, you're saying criticizing the party. You criticize the party, you're seen as criticizing the nation. And we can see that in case of Israel also, that's the fantasy which Netanyahu has. And I want to highlight this part where fantasy Netanyahu may have, and he may not succeed, hopefully he wouldn't, is a lot of time, and I want to come back to how these forms of nationalisms are studied. They're studied separately, right? Again, not all of it, but some studied separately. And I found a lot of time where, and I'll bring back one of you topics, anti-Semitism. You bring back anti-Semitism because if you look at behavior of Netanyahu and Erdogan, they're more or less similar. Erdogan is possibly way ahead of, he's way ahead of Netanyahu. But look at the left circle here in Britain. Hardly anyone talks of Erdogan in the same way they talk of Israel, or Turkey in the way they talk of Israel. And why is that? And I would say the reason that is, of course, because there's an exceptionalization of Israel as a problematic entity. And that is anti-Semitism, by the way. Yeah. The fact that there might be few anti-Zionist Jews who also subscribe to does not make it not anti-Semitic in my view. There's an exceptionalizing of Israel as that evil power that's somehow influencing everyone. So even on the left circles, often here in the UK context and in India case, the argument would be that, look, Modi and Netanyahu are similar, okay? And India is learning from Israel. Reality is, India doesn't need to learn from Israel. India has been doing that for longer than Israel has done. And both of them and learning a lot from China, which is a different kind of regime. So I just wanted to also put that in the circle. I wish we were in person, then we would have a proper discussion on all of this. Is while criticizing, in this case, a right-wing movement or right-wing ideology in case of Israel, where in terms of very exclusionary, the whole idea is to de-democratize, we have to bear in mind that similar forms of nationalism exist both in left and right-wing context, which can be based on bigotry and prejudice. And I wanted to, I'm not ending, but I wanted to say that the reason I was keen on when you invited me for this is the couple of reasons I want to come. And one is, and it's not philo-Semitism. I'm not into that. It's not, oh, somehow Israel is a great place, or philo-Semitism. Why do I need to tell you what philo-Semitism? It's not because of that. It is because the similar movements taking place, and I do believe, and I do want to connect it to my own politics and my own position within the university and outside university, that I do not believe in exceptionalizing any state as problematic and exceptionally evil in that context. So obsession that I understand why Palestinians would have, let's say, hate Israel, whatever they do. I'm not making a judge. I would not judge Palestinians for what they do in that context. But I do find it odd that non-Palestinians, when they exceptionalize Israel, when they exception even I'm not saying Netanyahu, but even that movement, and they're okay with India or not, and they're fine with Turkey, they might even love China. I don't get that point. So I want to connect that to the fact that the reason I also wanted to come to Israel, of course, is oppose boycott, divestment, sanctions. Maybe some of you support, some of you don't. I don't know your politics, but I'm quite public about it. I do. And in last 1 year, last 1 year I've been. So I and the Research England EDI expert advisory group, we were investigated because of government minister, thankfully gone. I'm still surviving. She's gone now. She called us radical anti-Israel academics a year ago. So we were investigated for that. There was nothing that she had to give compensation. She had to apologize. Right. That's one. Second, at the same time, I was being called a Zionist or playing both sidism because I criticized Hamas on 7th and after 7th October. Recent times, apparently, and I'm saying apparently because on Instagram, there's a post with my image, and I'm a queer person, by the way. I identify as queer. I had an image saying stay queer. And they says he's a sellout. He used to have such progressive and pro-liberation politics. And now because of power and those behind him, he has become pro-Israel. I'm not pro-Israel, by the way, but that's how it's portrayed. So every time I've said anything against Hamas, or what I call Hamas washing, where people see 7th October as, decolonization, not a metaphor, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, every time spoken of that, there's always an exception. There's a hidden hand behind me that my own politics cannot change, that I may not myself realize, for instance, how anti-Semitism is rife in various parts of universities in the West. Somehow there has to be a hidden hand behind me. So my own agency of my intellectual politics is taken away, and somehow the notion that because of becoming a deputy vice chancellor, become a senior leader, I have to, and there's a hidden hand. Who's that hidden hand? And that itself we know is from 100 years in plus in the UK context, in Western context, the powerful Jews. I've been told explicitly that, oh, you are now doing this because, of course, for power reason. So I wanted to just highlight, I know it's a bit distraction from my own subject, but I did want to highlight that because we need to, we must. And I was very keen on coming, but I couldn't come. But I do hope that some of the things I've covered, and it's not what I organized, did catch a lot that the challenges you're facing, Israeli challenges people are facing in different parts of the world. And I wanted to emphasize India, China, Turkey in particular. And I wanted to connect it to Ariel David, who talked of freedom part. When he talked of his father, when he said he came from Romania, so you could see Romanian context was not a right-wing nationalist context. It was a communist context. And people could breathe. So when you could find the things that breathe. The challenge, of course, with all these forms of nationalism is ultimately they prevent people from breathing. They prevent people because they take away the freedom of people to be themselves. They take away the freedom, not only political freedom in terms of having, self-determination or having your own state in case of, let's say, Palestinians or Kashmiris or Uyghurs or Tibetans or Baloch or others in case of Pakistan or Kurds. They take away that. They take away the freedom of religious and ethnic minorities to be themselves, have their own language, have their own culture. They take away that freedom. They take away the freedom of those from the majority who may not subscribe, the liberals and the progressives, because they can't be themselves. They all have to conform. And ultimately, therefore, I would say that the majoritarian regimes ultimately fascist in that form, because for them, the main enemy is freedom. For freedom of people to be themselves, freedom of people to think for themselves, and freedom of people to have solidarity with others. And that is what they want to conquer, and that's what they've been doing. So on that note, I'll end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I must say that in some sense, it was kind not only of a keynote talk, but also a condolence talk because I don't remember when I felt not so much alone. So thank you for that, for your collegial solidarity, and also for exposing the underpinning of fear and the dynamism of fear and its working in various regimes, whether leftist or rightist. I'm sure that there are many questions here in the audience, but with your permission, I will exercise my power as chair and ask you one question that I already hinted at when in our correspondence. The politics of fear is very clear as a tool of creating an enemy, right? An enemy, whether from inside or outside. But acknowledging fear, acknowledging the other's fear, could serve, or what do you think about the acknowledgement of fear as a powerful tool for reconciliation, for bridging gaps between communities and creating a more desired reality, at least for us, who is us, yeah, ignore that. Yeah, okay, so that was my question, and there are many in the audience. How would you like would you like to take one by one?
You, the chair, you decide. I can take two, three.
Yeah, I'm very forgetful, so I will prefer to do it one by one.
Okay, so I'll do one by one, and I'll keep it brief. So, no, thank you. You're right. But see, acknowledging the fear of the other requires us to not dehumanize the others, right? And of course, the key thing we have discussed dealing with the majoritarian self versus the enemies are that the enemies are all enemies, internal, external, all of them are the dehumanized ones. So there's a dehumanization process. You're right. If we do acknowledge fear of the others, then we acknowledge others as equal human beings, and therefore they can be bridge building. Therefore, the majoritarian nationalist movements and then the regimes when they are in power, their focus is also on constant dehumanization, where even if the majority self, not majority, but majority self, if I want to acknowledge you and your fears, I will be told that's stupid, that's wrong, that's a symbol of your weakness, that's because you're effeminate, that's you're feminine, that's because you need to be strong, masculine self. That has to conquer fear. You conquer your fear and you don't acknowledge others' fear. And that is how extremist movements function. So that's, yes, acknowledge fear of the others would be there, but that is why they don't want us to acknowledge the fear of the others, because they don't want us to acknowledge the others as equal human beings. Now, again, thank you so much for having me here. I said, I wish I was there, but I can't, but please carry on with the struggle you have. I do hope, I did mean it when I said that your pro-democracy movements, I'm using pro-democracy deliberately, can be inspiration for others. That's not what right-wing there might want. That's not what left-wing here might want, because, of course, seeing Israel offering anything in democracy is seen as an anathema for them. But that's not our problem, because we have to have solidarity and learn from each other. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.